process work is an applied discipline, and I was exposed to it nearly a quarter century ago, thanks to Pulin. Then I completed my internship at the ripe age of 49, and started as a resource person, then as a facilitator, and along with these stages in small groups and large communities, there were a few concept sessions, many reviews, and many reflections coming from the ENR committee. And in facilitation, there were faculty building sessions, there were evening meetings during the program, and there was also faculty closure. There were also meta labs. Yet, there was no manual or textbook that we relied upon. And I never felt the need for it because somehow my mind was tied to this idea of learning from living. And I also had understood something from Krishnamurti's talks about conditioning and emptying of the consciousness and so on. But during the course of this kind of exposure, I had heard the terms phenomenological and existential, and as our friends explained, those constituted levels of experience below that of the transactional or the normative one. I didn't give much thought to the origin of these terms, but somehow my mind was turned towards Sankhya, because Pulin also used to say that our view of process work is based on the Sankhya philosophy, and not, to my mind, I distinguish between Sankhya and Vedanta. While what struck me in Sankhya was a very direct and forthright claim that was made in favor of discriminative knowledge of the manifest, the unmanifest, and the cognizer, the knower. And only such knowledge can help overcome the three kinds of pain that is a part of the human condition. That's what Sankhya said, and it impressed me quite a lot. And the other thing that Sankhya mentioned was that scriptural knowledge is not going to come to our help in overcoming pain and suffering. It is only discriminative knowledge which is going to help us. So this was the most ancient school of philosophy, which was talking about knowledge of the self as a means of overcoming pain and suffering. And then Sankhya went into describing properties of matter, spirit, and the ways of extricating spirit from the labyrinth of matter. So Sankhya identified internal organs, will, I principle, and mind as the key to discriminating the subtle differences between the experience and the experiencer. To me, this discriminative knowledge was an ever-flowing current, and it was not a reservoir of collected water, which, to my mind, scriptural knowledge became. In turning to a study of Sankhya, I was also trying to find for myself some legitimacy and authority for the practice of process work. And when you turn to an ancient source, it has the quality of sounding eternal and mystical, and it also establishes me as a descendant in an unbroken line of a hallowed tradition. So it does something to me and my worth as a practitioner of a discipline. I also get drawn into the world of conventions and its own rules for assigning importance. So I presented a paper on Sankhya at an Astha conference, and I felt good that I had brought Sankhya to the notice of my fellow process workers. Now, this is not only an individual phenomenon, as I look at it, but there seems to be a collective one that goes nearer a process which the eminent sociologist M.N. Srinivas called as Sanskritization. In the original form, Sanskritization means a tendency among the lower strata to raise their proximity to a higher status. And how do they do it? They try to do it by adopting the customs and ways of the life of higher strata or higher castes. So, Sanskritization means adoption of ideas, values which have been expounded in Sanskritic literature, which has been regarded as the holy books. To give an example, Gurgaon, which is next to Delhi, stands, or it stood much lower than Delhi in the status index. And Gurgaon tried to gain respectability by renaming itself as Gurugram. So that is an instance of Sanskritization. So in our case, a search for roots in ancient literature seems to be driven by a need to provide legitimacy as well as authority to the practice of process work. And ancient works exude an aura of timeless wisdom, and hence they carry for many Indians unquestionable and undisputed authority. Pulin also used to mention that in the process work practiced by him, it was a blend of Western and Indian philosophies. He didn't care to explain much about the particular schools that had come to be blended. Perhaps he didn't want attention and interest to be diverted from the central tenet of learning from living. Process work by its nature is a discipline that evolves from a way of life. It's not a pedantic or scholastic pursuit, but as a discipline that aims to serve both the participants and the practitioner. It has a strong connect with some philosophical schools. Sankhya of the East and phenomenology and existentialism of the West appear to be those philosophies which seem to be giving a foundation to the practice of process work. In Pulin's own persona, he represented blend very well. His dress and diet were Indian, language he used would alternate between Hindi and English, and he was fond of the latest technology and their technological gadgets. But he had an independent and very original view of life and matters, and it was fluid, it was not frozen. So far as Westernization is concerned, what we find is that the concepts and frameworks in Western theories are based on very rigorous definitions and clarity. They are also known over large parts of the world, unlike most Sanskrit sources. So for these two reasons of clarity and spread, Western theories become very attractive to those of us who like structure, clarity, and also like stature. Structure promises reduction of anxiety, and our corporate sector in India also leans very heavily on Western theories. There's a thin line between using a concept to clarify something and using a concept as knowledge itself. So one can use the concepts to simply give a particular impression, or one can use the concepts to gain clarity. Phenomenology is what we are going to look at now. And phenomenology as a discipline in philosophy is concerned with the study of how we experience things and is closely connected with the meanings which things have in subjective experience. For instance, research has a conceptual meaning of addition to knowledge. But the phenomenon of research is experienced by most researchers as a frustrating struggle to arrive at truth. So there is a phenomenological reality of research and there is a conceptual meaning of research. So the important feature of phenomenology as a method is to study experience from the first person point of view, to study conscious experience from the first person point of view. This started gaining currency with a German philosopher called Edmund Husserl. He published two books in the first decades of the 20th century. And he was the first one who would say that each person would have his or her way of looking at the object. And the word that was used was construct. This simple notion that people understand and experience things in their subjective ways can pose very grave challenges to power structures which do not brook any dissidence. So, a teacher who is authoritarian would want students to understand things only in a particular way, and no other meaning would be acceptable. Whereas, what Husserl was saying is that each student will understand things in his own way. So, dissidence arises from people who experience things in ways which are different from those of the establishment. So the question of separating the object from our experience of that object led Husserl to locate the world of objects and focus on our experiences. So at some stage, Husserl said that I have to differentiate the world of objects from my experiences, so I will bracket my experience. That is the way he started developing his method. And then his one-time student, Heidegger, who was also in the same university, Heidegger was not very comfortable with this idea of bracketing. And Heidegger took phenomenology to a different level by arguing that the being which experienced the objects was always present in the world. And in 1927, he wrote his very famous book called Being and Time. So this book was published in 1927, Being in Time. And that was within the first decade after the end of the First World War, and also within the first decade after the Russian Revolution. So these facts are important. So Heidegger was saying that the being which experienced the things was of primary importance, and not the object and its experience. That is there, no doubt. But who is experiencing it? It is the being. And that needs to be focused upon. So that was his primary concern. According to Heidegger, there is a consciousness of things in the phenomena that I have experienced, and there is also a consciousness of itself, which Ashok referred to as self-reflexivity, that there is a consciousness of itself in the being. Husserl was saying that, yes, there is a reflexiveness, but the experience is pre-reflective. So there is a slight difference there. So I experience things, and later I try to create a construct. But when I experience things, it is pre-reflective. According to Husserl, consciousness reaches out to objects because we connect ourselves to that experience in some way. So when I write this paper, I connect it to it in some way. I am present in that paper. And we ask that question, where are you in this? So there is a purpose that we carry which connects us to everything that we see, do, and think. And Heidegger's being is always a being in the world. So he calls that as Dasein. That's the German word that he uses. It's never being, according to Heidegger. It is being in the world. So it is that being in the world is not a point, but it's more of a field or a region. It is fluid, dynamic, and free-floating, rather than a fixed or a stable entity, like the one conveyed by the term, say, personality. Yeah? So it is very fluid, and this field holds and has space to hold different ways in which we think of ourselves and other human beings. So it has room for contradictions, and it has many such rooms. So for Heidegger, being in the world is necessarily involved in both authentic and inauthentic modes of existence. And he goes on to talk about the awareness of death, impending death, and what human beings try to do to deal with this awareness of the impending death as authentic or inauthentic modes of existence. Uh, so the phenomenological methods which were developed as a result of the work of Husserl and Heidegger, they came to be practiced, and their search was with the way participants in any situation experienced things, made sense of their context, and thought about the choices before them. So that was the primary focus of phenomenological methods. It led to the notion that each actor in a situation might have his or her version of the situation experienced by them. So we refer to multiple versions of reality. And this was very vividly brought out by the famous Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa in his 1950 film, Rashomon, which presented multiple versions of reality in a very dramatic manner and became one of the all-time great films. For those who wield power, it comes as a rude shock that their subjects are people who experience their rule quite differently. So the period of early 20th century was a period when great social turmoil was taking place. It was the rise of industrial society, which deployed technology for improving the standard of living. And it was a period of mass production of goods and services. In all aspects, society moved toward becoming a mass society. Mass production, mass education, mass media, mass entertainment. And it created and pursued a vision of modernity that would organize life in very efficient, rational, and consistent ways. The two world wars, however, brought out the wide gulf between the vision of modernity and actually the practice, which led to a conflict of interest among industrial powers. The war, the genocide, and the massive destruction of life shook up the credibility of leaders everywhere. So the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre took the ideas of Husserl and Heidegger and he took them on a different plane. He was taken a prisoner of war in World War II, and he started writing his Being and Nothingness, which was published in 1943. For him, the being, or the sense of self, was the continuing flow of outcomes, of sequences of acts of consciousness. He also included radically free choices in the acts of consciousness. Sartre is associated with the school of existentialism. And he gave a famous lecture, Existentialism is Humanism, in 1946. And his central position was that existence comes before essence. Man first exists, engages with the world, and then comes to define what his essence is. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. That is the first principle of existentialism. That's what Sartre said in that lecture. And the consequence was that existentialism places entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon man's own shoulders. And he goes on to say that personal choices do not remain individual, but they concern all of us in many ways. Now, this was a very abstract idea, but he was actually sticking to what Heidegger had said, that being is always a being in the world. And the personal choice reflects how the being can deal with the world. And in that sense, it can become either an example to be followed or avoided for the rest of the world. Because the being is always present in the world. This fact that personal choices are not personal, they concern everyone, it, for Sartre, enhances a sense of responsibility. So responsibility is a very great concept for Sartre. Because from the moment man is thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. And for this particular situation, Heidegger has used the term abandonment, that man is abandoned in the world. So it implies that we ourselves decide our being. One implication is that we create our reality by acting upon our choices, which are conscious or otherwise. And our choices, our actions, and our undertakings cumulatively create our life. So, for Sartre and the existentialists, there is no human essence that can be considered fundamental. This is another very radical statement, that there is no essence which is fundamental. There is no human nature that can be conceptualized in any generalized way. There are no natural human types. What can be generalized is the basic human condition, that human beings are thrown into this world to be on their own, and they constitute themselves through a series of choices which they make at every stage. So, in understanding the human, we are, according to the existentialist school, we are focusing on the particular, on the specific, and on the concrete aspects of human behavior. The existentialist view has two more important aspects. One is it views the human being from the point of his being and acting in the world. And these actions and interactions lead to the formation of whatever that person may consider his essence. Heidegger does not accept the notion of essence, because for Heidegger, the being is always in a state of flux, and being cannot be tied down to a particular entity, because being is always in the world and it's always in a stage of formation and reformation. This means that the human being can be understood only in terms of acting and interacting with others who constitute their environment. Secondly, as we said earlier, individual actions will have larger significance. Now, in the post-war world, both phenomenologists and existentialists had created the ground for restoring the primacy of human being and human experience, and they had tried to remove the influence imposed on them through organized religion as well as organized power structures. The end of World War II nurtured the hope for lasting world peace, but the atom bomb and its aftermath led to armed conflict in Southeast Asia, arms race, and the Cold War. And the common people who had borne the brunt of war in terms of destruction of life and property rose in protest against the repressive policies of their respective governments. And in US, it found an expression in the hippie movement, which coincided with Poulen's years at Berkeley, and also the students' protests against their government's policies in France and Europe. So what became very strong in those movements was liberation from state repression. That was the most common demand in these protests. And the underlying theme was that people's experience of war held primacy over declarations of national interest and patriotic intent by political and religious leaders. I will skip the influence of the hippie movement on other things and go directly to how this has affected our practice of the process work discipline. So, first of all, our process work takes place in groups, which are constituted from participants and facilitators. We sit at the same level. We try to make sense of participants sharing from our own being, which means that we also share our data and our meanings. And these are not prescriptions. Prescriptions have no place, and they would actually stand in the way of an authentic mode of living. Similarly, the principle of responsibility comes into play very early in the life of the group, in the way we expect participants to claim their space. So that is, in a way, an invitation to take responsibility. And there is a whole universe of passivity, aggression, fear, compliance, conformity, and powerlessness, which may exist in the group as well as in the individuals. And it's a very important process to get in touch with that universe. The process is, we always say the process is always on, though I may not be in touch with it. And I may slip into an inauthentic mode of living, by attributing to others the source of my actions, feelings, and suffering. So there are various ways in which we try to bring this realization back to the participant that the process is always on. Uh, the sharing and reflection in the group is at the core of process work. To open up to the world is to accept one's reality without reservations and claim both the freedom and responsibility for oneself. Finally, I'll just mention a few things about Pulin. Pulin combined these several strands in his own being, and he ventured out to offer it in a very unique blend. But at the base was his insistence on the validation of human experience. And who can validate my experience? No theory, no scripture, no dogma can validate my experience. It's only I who can validate my experience. And it does not require a validation from external source. That does not mean that I'm close to the world. I can make sense of what the others are saying, but the responsibility to validate my experience lies with me. And I've seen Pulin insist on participants sharing their own meaning of a particular phenomenon. At times, he would also consult dictionaries, but those were not the final source of validation. So far as Pulin was concerned, he insisted on our being able to validate our own experience by ourselves, and that was very fundamental. I remember one particular event in our campus when we held a mushaira, and Pulin said the only condition is that people have to read their own poems. Whether however good, bad, or ugly they may be, they have to read their own poems. And several of us read our poetry for the first time in that particular event. Because he said, your experience is valid for you, you share it. Let the world make whatever it wants to make of that. So, in that sense, he was very, very insistent upon this validation. Pulin also made a slight distinction from the Heideggerian and Sartrean way of looking at the world. He made a distinction at the level of proximity, and he used the terms system and collectivity to denote the difference. And in both cases, of course, he stuck to the phenomenological position that both the system and the collectivity were created, constructed by the individual from and through his experience. And when people used to ask him about changing the world, he would always say that we have to start with changing the primary system, which is the family. So that was, in a way, his own way of giving importance to one's primary system. He said, unless the primary system changes, you cannot change the world. This was one, I think, insight that he had gained from years of work in the Indian context.